It's Friday, April 3rd. I'm talking to Linda Duncan, who is NDP Member of Parliament for Edmonton-Strathcona and the NDP's federal environment critic. Yesterday in the House of Commons, Linda Duncan raised a pretty shocking health issue about people in northern Alberta. Can you tell me about that, please, Linda?
Well, it's been an issue that's actually been known for quite some time and just hasn't really come out of Fort Chipewyan in a big way. And that is concerns that have been raised by their family doctors for quite some time with higher than average rates of some of the cancers. This really came to light when Dr. John O'Connor, who was the most recent family physician, and in fact still commutes from Nova Scotia to serve as one of their family physicians. That's how dedicated he is to them. Revealed, in no big flashy way, but just simply publicly revealed his concern that he thought that there were much higher rates of some cancers in that community and that really should be looked into. The response by Health Canada, the federal government, of course, is responsible for the health of First Nation peoples. That's a federal responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility. And the response by Health Canada, rather than looking into this issue, was to file complaints with the Alberta Physicians and Surgeons Association. They apparently filed, I think, 5 or 6 complaints. They have since withdrawn the majority, and only one is outstanding. And that complaint is that he caused undue alarm in the community.
What is it that led to Dr. O'Connor's concerns? Was he seeing illness among his patients?
He was seeing a number of rare cancers and other cancers at a much higher rate than he thought in the smallness of the community. And there has been concern for quite some time with people living downwind and downstream of the tar sands. And he wasn't even alleging, there's a direct impact. He just said, given that, probably should look at it, and the concern that the people live on the water from the Athabasca River and from fish from the Athabasca River. And in fact, there is already an advisory on those fish because there's a certain level of contamination. So the reason why I became involved is because, of course, I'm from Alberta and I've worked for quite some time with First Nations peoples, and I had the privilege of being included in their big gathering last summer where there were about 300 Aboriginal people who gathered, and a lot of concern raised there about fish having cancers and people dying of cancers. In fact, there was an elder flown back in for a funeral, elders in the casket. Very, very sad time for the community. And so I've been following this for quite some time. Now, Alberta Health, the Cancer Board, I think, finally did a review of these cancers, and in fact the report has verified that there are a number of cancers that seem higher than average, and they recommended that this warrants a further closer look. And so what seemed obvious to me is, first of all, Health Canada is responsible for First Nations people, should be looking into this directly. I frankly don't understand why it's going to the Alberta Cancer Board. Perhaps they could explain that. But secondly, in the Federal Environmental Protection Act, there actually is a mandatory duty on the Federal Minister of Health where information comes to her attention that there may be a potentially relationship between a toxin that's regulated under the Act and the health of peoples. They're supposed to immediately investigate into it. So in Parliament yesterday, I put a question to the Minister, and that was, will she end this witch hunt against Dr. O'Connor, who's simply representing the best interests of his patients? And secondly, will she finally trigger this study?
And what did she say?
She wasn't there, but her parliamentary secretary gave a very disappointing reply, simply saying federal government's already spending a lot of money on First Nation peoples. So basically, it's just a brush off. So I get the opportunity to follow up in the evening in a much more in-depth question, and I intend to do that. And I understand that there are other things going on behind the scene, which I can't really speak to, but I think will be revealed very soon. The good news is the Parliamentary Committee on Environment Sustainability, at my request, have agreed to bring hearings that we're looking into the impact on water of the tar sands, and they've agreed to bring those hearings to Alberta. So in the week of the 11th of May, they will be having hearings in Fort Chipewyan, in Fort McMurray, in Edmonton, and in Calgary.
In related news, today's newspapers reported that Suncor had record fines levied against it for environmental infractions. What's your take on this story?
My take is there's far too much attention on what Suncor hasn't done and not enough attention on what the government hasn't done. The thing that is so shocking to me is that apparently this violation has been going on for 5 or 6 years, and the government never even saw fit to go in and properly inspect. So apparently it was a great surprise to them to discover that they hadn't actually put the controls in place for hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is, of course, an extremely toxic substance. But in investigating further today, I've also discovered that despite the fact that the operations emit benzene, which is one of the most toxic substances, is regulated by the federal government, they still have not seen fit to put in place any binding standards related to benzene. So I think that the whole regulation of the tar sands merits a much closer look for the aspect of the people who work in the facility, and also for the people who are living in the close proximity or downwind or downstream.
What is the fact that the Edmonton Journal today is reporting that there was no danger to human health or the environment say to you?
It's the response they always give. I'm sorry, it's just not adequate. Suncor was legally required to take this measure, and that's why they're convicted. So, it's a completely irrelevant response. Where the responsibility really lies is the government. It's the government's responsibility to impose the standards. It's government's responsibility to inspect and to enforce if there is a violation. And they completely fell down on, they seem to be falling down on even setting the appropriate standards, both the federal and provincial government and the Energy Board. Secondly, completely failing to exercise their responsibility and mandate, which is to monitor and inspect these major facilities. Apparently, they've simply left it to them to self-monitor and self-regulate. And third, took them so long to even discover this and take enforcement action. It's frankly shocking.
Self-monitoring and self-regulation appears to be the way the oil industry is regulated in Alberta.
By and large, that has been the case, and I think that when we're dealing with something as high profile and as potentially toxic and on such a large scale as the tar sands, it's simply a shock, I think, to people to discover that the government is not intervening in the way that they have. In the last couple of weeks, the Federal Minister of Environment, Jim Prentice, has been coming forth with all his grandstanding saying, I'm getting serious about enforcement. And all of a sudden we discover in this major, industrial sector, not only are they not enforcing, they're not even inspecting.